Well, good afternoon, and thank you, everyone. Along with myself, we have one of our lead volunteers, Dave Harness, who will be here. So if you have any of the tough questions, I'll defer to Dave to do this. So what I'd like to do is frame the way that I'd like to have our conversation in the standpoint that, in our museum, we really focus on three things. One is preserving the firefighting heritage of the Great Lakes Bay region, and we do that nominally through the preservation of 60 historically significant fire trucks, about 16,500 fire-related toys, and about 1,000 artifacts of different types of fire history, firefighting telegraphy, and other types of what I would call historical collectibles. And we do that then so that we can tell stories. And those stories are, number one, to kind of preserve that history. We're going to do most of that today. But also we try to help people understand, and particularly students, the relevant science, math, and engineering that has gone into the fire service technology all the way back to the early 1800s, all the way to the present day today. I'll make a couple of references to that. And then we celebrate that history because, within Bay City now, we're at about 150 years of firefighting history, a lot of colorful characters. We tend to think of today our politics in the city as being rigorous and robust. I would just suggest that from the early days of the fire department, politics involving the fire department were robust and colorful in that way. But during that, a lot of really exciting and important things have happened. And so, to tell the story, we need to go back in time to kind of the boom days of the lumbering era because it created some unique circumstances for Bay City and Bay County that really made available resource that allowed this town, this city, to technologically flourish in the fire service area. And a lot of times we don't understand that. I promise I'm not gonna spend all afternoon here with you. I'm gonna give you a little bit of the high color on that. And then the person who really took that and shepherded it for nearly 40 years was Fire Chief Thomas Harding, who I would consider to be the grandfather or godfather of the fire service here in Bay City. And through those two lenses and the things that they brought to the table, while we have hundreds of different stories, I had to kind of focus on five. And five historic fires, four of them in Bay City, one of them in Crump, all are watershed events in the standpoint that they had significant impact at the time that they occurred, and they also had significant impact in improving fire or industrial safety into the future. And so that, again, I'll take your feedback at the end of this of, hey, Mike, did you pick the right five? I don't know. If that doesn't work the next time you need that, I have 95 more that we can kind of work through. The other question many people are going to want to have, so I have a couple of slides on this, is, hey, you guys are working on this old fire station number 3 from 1890, just down the street on Washington. Where's it at? What's up? I'll have a brief update there. And then we'll open it up, and to the best of my ability, if you have other questions about the fire service history or other types of relevant areas, more than glad to spend time doing that. So, again, I want to make this worth your while and the time that you've spent with us here today. Okay. So if we go back to, I say the 1880s, but the 1870s, the 1880s really became the heyday of the lumbering era here in Bay City, right? And in the standpoint here, we think of Bay City today in the post-1905 world of one big city, but at that time we were West Bay City and Bay City, really then thriving lumbering mills on the Saginaw River. And the thing that sometimes we struggle with, I think, understanding is at that time, the community was exceptionally wealthy. Obviously, there were, kind of a divide of those people who were very, very wealthy and those that were maybe in kind of more of I'll call it the poor working class. But the community itself had a tremendous amount of money that was able to be applied to things like public service, waterworks, and the fire department. And so in that area, the community really flourished in this area. And so, as kind of, said, look, if you go back and the first time a fire department was attempted to be formed was 1859, and through the late 1850s, 1860s, they were organized and disbanded, and there were all kinds of different political camps about how this should be done. And so it really was kind of in the 1860s, early 1870s, that we started to get formal organization of fire departments, at the time nominally volunteer staffed. That started to change in the late 1880 or early 1880s when we had a number of professional fire chiefs that were hired and fired. And the first one that kind of had some level of tenure was Thomas Harding, who was really hired and appointed as the chief fire engineer, which kind of the fancy terminology, what we would today call fire chief, in 1883. Obviously, as we kind of go through this, and I'll talk about just a couple of historical relics at the bottom in just a moment. One of the great things about getting a lot of money from the lumbering era is, you have a lot of wood. The problem when you start talking about big fires is lots of buildings were made of wood. And so sometimes the difference between a small fire and a large fire was luck or the weather conditions, right? And so in the standpoint here, wood was our financial savior, but it also was, as we'll talk about some of these large fires we had, it was somewhat of the major problem that we were facing in this area. So, just kind of put your history caps on, you go back to the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, right? Most of Chicago burnt to the ground at the time because most of the structures were made of wood. And so you have a dry summer, high winds, a fire starts. We could debate about, was it a cow or was it something else that started that fire? But basically, once something gets going, then it goes from building to building and you just have a conflagration. And we learned our lesson also in 1892 that I'll talk about in just a moment. But two things I just want to mention. I could spend hours talking about all the neat technology things we have, but Bay City had a municipal fire alarm system based on a telegraph system as early as 1876. So if you kind of think about that, right, telegraphy really advanced tremendously during the Civil War, and then a lot of commercial systems started to hit the market between about 1865 and 1870. We were a very early adopter, and it happened to be called the Pons fire alarm or Pons alarm system. It was quite novel, it was fairly complicated, and by about 1890, we ended up converting to a more traditional system that was called the Gamewell system. So really, if you start going around and looking at communities across the nation, Gamewell became kind of the predominant, it was like the GM of fire alarm systems. The other part, and the reason I just mention this is not to try to get too technical here, but Bay City, like many other thriving urban centers, elected to use what is called the Holley water system. And all I want you to know is that Holley, Bertzel Holley, was the engineer. He had a theory. And the theory was, instead of putting all the money into fire pumpers that would be driven around your city, he would put a large set of pumps at the waterworks and use high water pressure distribution, and all you really needed to fight fires were hose wagons that you could connect to the hydrants and work through there. And economically, and a lot of communities kind of bought into this, it was a very, very effective system. We'll see in just a moment, it had its limits, and especially, it was great if you had like one large building or a couple of small buildings, but if you started having multiple buildings in a block or multiple blocks, you kind of found that the water pumps at the waterworks were somewhat of a rate limiting step. And so that was one of the drawbacks, that nobody really understood what was the bounds of what that is. But I'm going to talk a bit about our learnings about the water system. But we were early adopters. You can kind of see in the Holley system, Bay City was system number 41, and it was kind of started at 1 in the country. So we were pretty high up there, right, about nationwide adoption. And then West Bay City was system number 97 in 1883. Okay, so I just want to set the stage. We were a community of wealth that could help fund a lot of interesting and impactful government projects. And as I said, the kind of the godfather or grandfather of that system happened to be Thomas Harding. And again, a very, very colorful character, but he came to the United States out of Canada, and he was a printer by trade. And so, it's kind of interesting, how does a guy who does printing become somebody involved in the fire department? And basically, he kind of got interested in this when he was working in Detroit. He and his family moved up and he started a couple of printing and newspaper operations. And as the city fire department was growing, he made the hop over. He joined as a member in 1868 and then joined and was appointed to the fire chief role in 1883. As I mentioned, politics in Bay City is not anything new. You'll notice that the council vote to appoint him fire chief, which nominally is normally something that's done by unanimous consent, it was 8-5, right? So we kind of had the pros and the cons, but that probably at the time in 1883 was one of the best decisions that the fathers of our community could have made, because he was very, very insightful, very visionary, and as we'll learn in a couple of minutes, his access and understanding of the trade press made Bay City and Bay City Fire Department well recognized around the country, right? Because he was able to communicate very, very effectively about some of the neat things that were going on in the fire department. I always kind of say, we think of, today we at times will think, geez, the media can be easily manipulated. I'll go back to the 1880s and say it was just we didn't have the internet at the time, but it was kind of a slower way. But the media was well managed by Thomas Harding, and to the benefit of the community. Obviously as he did this, Bay City was routinely featured in the fire trade press. So like every quarter, there would be some innovation or some major event that was being reviewed there. And then the other part with technology is, while he advanced many things in the fire service technology, he was not the most rapid adopter of motorized fire apparatus. It wasn't until 1911 that the wheels were set in motion for the purchase of the first piece of motorized apparatus. There was motorized apparatus in this country starting about 1905 to 1907. It wasn't that we were like at the back end of this thing, but it started then the process that by 1925, that was the last fire horse that was still in service in Bay City in 1925. And there happened to be a real big parade and event to celebrate the last 2 fire horses that were taken out of service, and the whole fleet switched to motorized apparatus. And then he served in the role of fire chief until the day of his death, which happened to be in 1912. And then the person that he had kind of groomed for that role took over, and that was a very, very effective transition. As I kind of mentioned, and we'll go through several of these, we converted to the more standard Gamewell fire alarm telegraph system in 1890. We'll talk about the conflagration in 1892, the Masonic Temple fire in 1903. The 2 fire departments merged as part of the city merger in 1905. We'll talk about the Fraser Hotel fire, and then the introduction of motorized apparatus. The one picture I'll share up on the upper front, and it's interesting, we have discovered actually in the basement of the Historical Society here, that table on the left-hand side, which was kind of the electronic front end of the Bay City fire alarm system, has been kept in storage here since the mid-1950s. Kind of rediscovered a couple of years ago, and as we talk about some things that'll be going on in the Fire Museum in the future, we hope to be able to kind of do some public displays. It had been displayed in City Hall up through the 1950s, and then was converted to storage in a variety of locations as part of the Historical Society here. The other thing I'll just say is this vision that Thomas Harding had for the fire community, like the Gamewell fire alarm system, that infrastructure stayed in place in Bay City all the way up through 1957, when finally there was enough deployment of telephones that people could use telephones to call for emergency service. And it just became kind of a very high maintenance piece. There's lots of interesting stories in the Bay City Times about how retired people were taken out of the Gamewell Engineering Department to come to Bay City to keep it going. But that lasted for us for 70 years nominally. And then we had the base of that telegraph system for about 15 years previous. He was the architect of then the movement. We'll talk about stations 1 and 3 that were on Washington Avenue to McKinley and Adams, and that was opened in 1917 of a centralized fire station. And then he set the framework for the modern apparatus fleet. The sad part about this is he died in September 1912, and he and his wife are buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery, the old St. Patrick's Cemetery, and both the grave sites do not have headstones. And that's a project that we're going to be undertaking in the community here. We got to fix that. Now, I believe at one time there were headstones there, and it's just that they kind of degrade it, and through the years of weather have kind of disintegrated and disappeared. But we're working right now with extended members of the family who are in the Detroit area just to try to get, the guy did a lot for the community, and it's kind of sad that, he's there with you go by and there's no memorialization or recognition of that. Okay, so I set the stage. Lumbering era gave us at least the capability to utilize and look at a lot of different technologies. We had the benefit of Chief Thomas Harding coming to the table. And so we're going to look at 4 of the 5 fires are Bay City oriented. One is northwest of here in Crump. But we had, like all major communities in the Tri-County area, we had our conflagration. It happened in the late 1870s in Midland. It happened in 1893 in Saginaw. Ours was by far the worst in just the size of it, but it happened in July of 1892. And again, right, we had really 3 things that came together that are always present when conflagrations occur. Number 1, a dry summer. Okay. Number 2, lack of rain. And number 3, we had high winds. In that regard, you put those together, all you have to do is have a fire and it's going to start moving all over the place. Now, we had the other benefit, or the other setting part of, we had a whole waterfront, right, full of lumbering facilities and sawdust and wood. And so the first part here, and obviously, as we try to go back and say, how did the fire of 1892 start? There are lots of theories about this, but one of them goes back to the fact that a couple of days before, there was a large mill fire in the July 23rd, and that was at the Miller Brothers facility on the north side of the Middle Grounds. That fire lasted for several hours. It was extinguished, but there were many piles of sawdust and other material that were still smoldering. There are theories that there were tugs and boats going up and down the Saginaw River, and there were embers that were being emitted from some of the boiler houses there that might have been the source. But again, high winds, dry conditions, lots of wood. It's kind of, all of a sudden you get any source of fire, it's going to be a problem. And so I'll show you in a minute, but the first sign of the alarm occurred at about 2 o'clock at Miller and Turner's Mill. We'll look at a map in just a moment. And the first alarm box that was sounded to acknowledge the fire happened to be box 65, right on the foothill of 31st and Water Street. Now, if you go back when I talked about the Holly water system, once the fire started to involve multiple buildings, we quickly ran out of water. Okay, so the whole part was this design of trying to be economical in how we provided the fire water supply. It quickly got overtaxed. I would suggest we didn't have enough manpower and equipment anyway, but it's just that at that point, we didn't have any water. And this fire progressed from 2 o'clock until 7 o'clock. And in that time, 40 blocks on the south end of Bay City were destroyed. And you can kind of see I have the count there. And it's important, right, that we have saloons in the account, right, as we kind of look at that. But I mean, 232 dwellings, 2 churches, 30 stores, and you can see the rest of the things. The recorded loss was $3 million in 1892 currency. Okay, so you go fast forward here, I mean, we're talking $30 to $40 million of value there. Throughout all of that destruction, however, there was only one fatality. You talk about kind of an amazing sequence of events there. And that person tried to go back into their home to retrieve valuables. Okay, so this whole thing of once you get out of the house, never in a house fire, never go back in. Unfortunately, we continue to learn that lesson in 1892. Now, I had the opportunity to read the report of the fire authored by Chief Harding, right, the guy who was the press guy. And it's an interesting story of heroics and all these wonderful things that the fire department did, when in reality, it was the wind shifted direction. I mean, if we really step back, and that's what kept the fire from going to 50 blocks or 60 blocks in that regard. But it's kind of interesting, right, as people try to memorialize some of these historical events. And really, the only organized fire departments that could be drawn upon included West Bay City, in addition to Bay City, West Bay City, Saginaw, which had their units come up by horse, and Flint, which sent their apparatus by rail. that was your fire department and mutual aid that was available at the time. Okay. So the lessons and impact. So number one is we learned at the time, and this was really a pivotal moment in Chief Harding's adamant continued work with the city commission and basically the fire board of the city at the time about getting what he called fire limits, where he wanted to have more buildings built of masonry and brick, or at least to limit the areas in which wood structures could be, after he saw the destruction and the rapid pace of that destruction in 1892. Obviously, we now understood the limits of the Holly water system, and in 1893 and 1894, the city obtained several steam fire engines where they were taking now still the Holly water system, but taking more pumping capability that could be brought closer to the fire, and they could also draft water from wells, cisterns, and from the river. What's also very interesting is this fire, while it wasn't the cause of the decline of the lumbering era, it kind of then, this mill never rebuilt, and you really start to see kind of the winding down phases of the lumbering era, right? Which had lots of implications for both our employment as well as some of the tax revenue that was there. If there's a neat historical fact that I like to share is, right, I said the first alarm box that was indicated of the fire was box number 65. And in the 1950s, there was a benevolent society that generated two things. One is they provided a canteen service for the fire department, and that if you look at the picture closely, it says Box 65 Association. And before there were large amounts of insurance available for critically injured or fatally injured firefighters, the group of people who founded Box 65 threw money into a kitty that was kind of like a life insurance program for the firefighters in the city of Bay City. So kind of a neat thing. A couple of years ago, as we were going through some archives at the Fire Museum, all of a sudden, and it wasn't quite nice as shiny as the box is there, but that box, to the best of our ability right now, it is of the right era. It's an 1890 box. It was given to us by somebody who had it in their home in Bay City in the basement. And the inside and outside all are consistent with indicating Box 65. I don't have the provenance to say, I know it was on the street corner, but we have that now in our museum, and we are with a working display of the fire alarm telegraph, right? We talk about science and math and engineering. We go through the history with children about how do you call a fire department? And they'll say, oh, we'd use the cell phone, right? Well, then when we have a telephone booth, we go to the landline, and then we start talking about the fire alarm telegraph. And so we get them to do that, but then we also let them put their hands and activate Box 65, right? Which kind of has that other little part of, you're now doing something that the people who initially created the alarm for the Great Conflagration did. So we're building that as part of the history of the museum that is there. But again, lasting impacts, and while we've had some other large fires, we've never had the fire of the extent of 40 blocks that has occurred in Bay City. It was, at the time, in the 19th century, it was the largest municipal, urban municipal fire loss throughout the 1800s. So Bay City's fire in the state of Michigan was the largest lost urban fire with the conflagration that occurred there. All right, so let's now move forward, and this one is just, it's important, number one, because of the historic legacy and the fact that the building itself still is here, but it also gave some very, very important lessons that were learned in what I would call public assembly buildings. And so really on the corner of 6th and Madison, today stands, now I think the Bay Arts Council has this building, but the old Masonic Temple, you see it in the bottom right-hand side. But in 1893, it was the building, and that's kind of an artist's rendition of that building. But it was kind of like of this Moorish or Turkish design with all of these very, very large domes and very ornate finishings. Pratt and Cope were the architects of this, and right, they're the prolific architects that include buildings like Fire Station Number 3, as well as City Hall and many of our other important public buildings here. And it was obviously the center of fraternal life for the Masons, but it also was a building that was used a lot for public functions, events, and meetings. And so at the time in 1903, it was a very, very important civic and public assembly building. And on May 19th, and again, like all good fires of the old vintage type, there's a little debate about exactly what happened. The most plausible event is that there were some electrical irregularities inside the building. There is also a story about a lightning strike. I tend to discount that one a little bit, but those are kind of the two competing theories of that. And while the outside of the building was made of masonry construction, the inside of the building was undivided wood construction. And so once the fire started, it was delayed in its detection. The building on the inside was totally destroyed very, very quickly. Fortunately, nobody was killed. There were a couple of firefighters injured in fighting this fire. And really, all of the towers were destroyed. The entire inside of the building was destroyed, but the outside of the building was intact. And if you kind of look after the event or after the presentation, if you want to look, the outside of that building and all of its predominant features are still in that building today. So basically the building, I call it was kind of the original cantaloupe job, where the outside of the building was kept there and all of the cantaloupe was taken out and they replaced the innards in that particular building. Okay, and Pratt and Coppe did the architecture for the renovation there. So the important lessons here were the use of unprotected, undivided, combustible construction in large public assembly buildings was something that got a lot of coverage around the country, because obviously if you have people in that building when that fire occurs and it spreads so rapidly, you could have had dozens, if not hundreds of deaths, right? And so, you go through the times in the early 1900s, there are many fires across this country, oftentimes in schools and theaters, where the fires occurred and hundreds of people died. So this was kind of one of the sentinel lessons that were there. It quickly was, again, the foundation in the building was intact. It only took 2 years to redo the building. It was reopened in 1905. And as I said, the major changes, in addition to just replacing all the inside things, is more subdivision and more fire-resistant features were there. The unusual artifact, and I'm going to pass this around, is that all of the copper cover on the domes that were on the building up here, during the fire, they started to melt from the fire that was there. And all of that copper was collected. And there were memorial coins used to raise funds for that. And I'll just pass this around. I just ask that I get it back when I'm done from our collection here. But you'll see the Morris design on one side, and on the obverse side of this, you'll see the memorialization about this burned in May of 1903. And so, there are hundreds of these coins that are circulating through Bay City that memorialize that 1903 fire. So I'll just pass that so you get a chance to touch the roof that was there in 1903.
What coin, Mike?
Yeah, what coin? Yeah, that's the risk I'm taking. But there's a pretty. It doesn't look like a seedy crowd, so I think there's some hope there. All right, now I want to jump out to a little known but very, very important incident that has in its legacy the lumbering era in it. And unfortunately, very, very few people know about this. And I have to actually thank Carol Maida from up in Pinconning, who does a fair amount of genealogical and historical resource, because I knew about the event, and she really helped feed me with a lot of information about this. But in 1910, February 10th, there was a lumbering mill on the Princing family estate where a boiler exploded. And fundamentally what happened is this was a lumbering processing camp. As opposed to bringing logs down the Saginaw River, they were taking logs and lumber that was being kind of felled kind of in a 10 or 15 mile area out of Crump. And it was kind of a center where basically horses would draw and drag lumber to there. And at about 7:19 in the morning of February 10th, a steam boiler exploded and 7 workers were killed. This was the single largest number of fatalities that occurred at any of our woodworking and wood lumbering mills in the history of Bay City, and yet very few people know about this. There was a significant memorial event that was put together by the citizens of Crump in February of 2010, and they even struggled to get a lot of details about this. And what's really sad is while there were 7 people killed, there were a number of people significantly burned and maimed. And as you can kind of imagine, today Crump is still kind of way out there, but put that kind of in the horsepower days. It overwhelmed the limited medical services. I mean, they were bringing in doctors from Bay City, from Auburn, and other areas there to the best of their ability to treat some of the people who were permanently maimed and disabled. Obviously, the people who were dead didn't last very long in this area. It leveled the sawmill and the surrounding structures. And like I said, it was the single largest number of deaths in one day in that lumbering area. The mill was not rebuilt, and what was kind of a burgeoning practice or burgeoning business in the Crump area of several lumber mills, it was kind of the beginning of the end of that for a couple of reasons that I'll share here. We've worked on trying to go through the archives of like the Bay City Times photograph and even some of the photojournalists. These are all second generation photos that have come through photo scans there, and I apologize for that, but I just wanted to kind of show you the destruction. It just leveled everything. It was a large pressure explosion that occurred there. Like many disasters, these things start with small deviations and drifts. But this is a case where the boiler that was used to generate power for the lumbering camp was a repurposed 40-year-old machine. It was started to be used, and I don't want to get into all the engineering details, but it was designed to operate at 48 pounds so that it could generate more power and more energy. They were running it at 100 pounds. That's not a good thing, right, when you're kind of built from there. However, at the time, there was no rigorous boiler code nationwide and not in Michigan. Okay, and so, there was a whole bunch of things that the investigators, and this actually came, my best source of data here was the Bay City Democrat, kind of like the legal reporting paper that would have a couple pieces of information, but they had a lot of information about the boiler inspection, and this was one of the catalysts for the generation of the first boiler and mechanical code that was published in 1914, right, about 4 years after this event. What I would just say, just to kind of put this in relevance, we just don't have boiler explosions anymore. And these happened, unfortunately. This was not a rare occasion. There were lots of things where people were operating and using boilers in inappropriate ways up to this point. But like, for example, I can't even take a old fire truck steam fire engine out to pump unless I have a boiler license that is inspected that year. I mean, that's how tight these rules have gotten, appropriately so, I'm not complaining. But before that time, it was kind of literally the Wild West. The thing that I find very important, and you'll see this when we start to talk about the fire at the Fraser Hotel, there were 7 people who lost their lives that ranged in age from 75, right? You think about people who are, kind of working well into their retirement age, and obviously a lot of young men that were there. And, part of this is just to kind of make sure that we keep those names visible because they paid the ultimate sacrifice that ultimately resulted in better safety regulation for boilers, and in this case, boilers in the lumbering era. All right, so let me take you quickly through a little walk through downtown Bay City. And the issue is with the demographics of the crowd, and I'm not saying you're all old, okay, that's not what I'm saying here, but you'll at least recall where the Bay City Planetarium is today. If we start to go back, many people will remember, I remember the Winona Hotel stood at that location. Now, I don't believe there's anybody who then can go back in time to 1906 and say, well, what was at the Winona Hotel location before the Winona Hotel? And it's something that once you know it, it kind of sticks with you. But the other major hotel fire that occurred was at the exact same location in 1906, and it was the Fraser Hotel or Fraser House fire. Now, the thing that I'm going to just kind of lead you, I'm going to lead with my punchline and then go through a little bit of the history here. But we have two hotels at the same corner, separated by 70 years, and frankly, we didn't learn anything. That's the scary part, and that's, in my case with history, it's if we don't remember and recall and apply our history, we're doomed to repeat it again. And I think we've proven that by these fires. Now, fortunately, I say fortunately, and this is like reverse, we only had one fatality at the Fraser House fire in 1906. If you recall, at the Winona Hotel fire in 1977, we had 15 people die. 15. It was, and I'm going to steal my slides here, it is the single largest death toll in one fire in the Great Lakes Bay region and in Bay County's fire history. Okay, so the issue is we didn't learn our lessons, and in this case, what was a catastrophe in 1906 became a double catastrophe in 1977. And what's remarkable about both of these hotels is that they started as opulent five-star locations, and as the competitive marketplace of hotel venues started to bring new players to the field, these opulent one or five-star hotels started to kind of move down the food chain until they became kind of boarding houses and apartments and started to get into decline. And it's that decline and the change of the way that the hotels were being used which ultimately led to the problems that resulted in the fire. And so, we had the Fraser Hotel, 1864, right at the end of the Civil War, kind of in the emerging heyday of Bay City's lumbering era. And that's why I go back to the lumbering area. It was the place to be. It was the top-notch hotel in the location. It was the landmark. Everybody wanted to be seen and have dinner there. And as the lumbering era went to an end and other competitors came to be, it started to have financial and sustainability issues that were there. And so in that particular case, right, maintenance is delayed. There are different uses for that hotel as opposed to kind of white glove service. And ultimately, what is the best of the record, and again, old records that are here, is that the fire started somewhere in the boiler area. Geez, we're getting back to that boiler code thing again. It kind of repeats itself here. Although this clearly seemed to be a boiler malfunction that caught fire to building components. This was not a boiler explosion. The building rapidly had fire. The good news about this is December 23rd, it was right before Christmas, the occupancy loading of the hotel was low. And so everybody was able to get out, except for they called him the building fireman, but he was basically the security officer who was going in and out. He got severely burned in the fire and died 2 days later, John O'Neill, okay? This fire, had that building been occupied under its normal loading in 1906, would have likely paralleled, if not exceeded, the death toll of the Winona Hotel fire, because there were not emergency exits or fire escapes. And that goes back to, I was talking about Chief Harding having fire limits and fire escapes, right, in this area. And as you read the record of this particular fire, Chief Harding's son, Thomas Jr., performed several heroic rescues of taking people out of their rooms outside the building, because he was a captain on Ladder Company number 3, which happened to be housed just in the building down the street here. And his father, I'm sure, was extremely proud. But had that kind of heroic stuff not happened, there would have been much more significant death toll in that particular area. The loss here, just to kind of put this in relevant terms, about $100,000 for the loss of the building and the contents. That's about $3.3 million in 2026 value here. So again, kind of a nice looking hotel, where the planetarium is now, and you see kind of what's left of it. And then I want to kind of then advance 70 years, right? And I can replay the same story. Opulent 5-star hotel, competing in really, I would call, the general decline of the business environment in downtown Bay City. There were several conversions, and the last conversion was to that of apartments. And so obviously you have people who were living there under maybe different socioeconomic standards than what was originally in place, and not a lot of attention to what people were doing in this particular area. It is pretty well recognized, and again, right, the documentation and technology that's available to put in how, the documentation of the fire. I was not here in the community in 1977, but Vic's Lounge, which was on the ground floor, is where the fire appeared to start. The problem in this is that there was smoke reported for several hours and that people were trying to investigate the source of the smoke before anybody called the fire department. And so what happened is, in the void spaces and the combustible construction inside the building, the fire definitely got an advance in this area. Now, what is interesting is when the Winona Hotel was built, and Jeff was just sharing with me on the header, we have an invoice of a dinner that was offered there, fireproof construction and fireproof rooms. They kind of in the early 1900s had advertised the fireproof construction, and there was a lot of part about the outside of the building. There wasn't as much conversation about the inside of the building, but it was advertised as fire resistive construction. And like I mentioned here, the location of the Delta College Planetarium. Like I said with Chief Harding's son in 1906, we had some good fortune and people who really went above the call of duty, because we were limited by the number of ladder trucks that were available by the fire service. The fire escapes, even in this building, were limited. And so many people were trapped as the fire advanced on the upper floors of the building. But for the fact that Michigan Bell had a number of telephone trucks with buckets and articulating booms that performed rescues, probably outside what any of the lawyers would say was acceptable safety practice. But there's lots of pictures of that activity going on. The death toll, while 15 was severe and significant, it likely would have been 30 or more. And that was just, all hands on deck in doing that. It also was a brutally cold day. And I've talked to firefighters who fought this fire. And so not only were you battling the fire, but literally everywhere you went, there were icicles hanging off everything. And, just trying to keep your feet on the ground was quite a practice. So it was just physically brutal for the people who were doing that. So the message I have here is, on this particular fire, in really 70 years, while we've advanced a bit in our technology, the fundamental lessons of trying to, number one, make sure we have the right number of escapes and ways to get out of these types of situations in an emergency. And then as buildings change use, that we just make sure we kind of keep track of how those are managed, both resulted in catastrophic outcomes for us. And again, you'll probably think a little bit now more about when you walk by the planetarium, some of its history there about the second fire. So those are kind of, the 5 fires right now that I think have kind of defined, and the one in Crump is really an explosion, but really have kind of defined the industrial and municipal fire environment here. Like I said, if you ever want a presentation for a group that you have here, I have about 100 of them that we can kind of tailor to the interest that you have here. All the way, kind of our most modern one is the MV Jupiter that occurred here in 1990, where we worked with our friends from the Saginaw River Marine Historical Society, all the way through to kind of the Westover Theater Fire, which is one of the first ones that was here in that area. So let me quickly walk you through an update about where we're at on fire station number 3, and then we'll kind of open it up a bit for questions and dialogue here. So like I mentioned about some of the other architecturally beautiful and significant buildings, including City Hall, Pratt and Cope did the design here. Fire station number 3, which is just down the road here, right near the corner of Washington and Columbus, was opened as a fire station in 1890. It served until 1917, when its location and the location of the headquarters station, which was right next to today's State Theater, that building, by the way, still stands. If you look up, you'll go, oh, I see what that is. If you look at the ground level, you go, oh, it's been modified substantially. But station number 3 was modified substantially, and so you had to kind of look up and go, oh, I see this is an old fire station. You couldn't do that from the ground. And so it was in service from 1890 to 1917. It never saw a motorized piece of apparatus. Everything in that station was horse-drawn. And so it housed hose company number 3, hook and ladder company number 1. It had a reserve steamer and the chief's buggy. Now, most people believe that the second story was all living quarters, and then the third story is where all the hay and oats was stored, and that is incorrect. It happened that the second story, the front, was living quarters and offices. The back is where all the hay and oats were stored. And there was actually kind of an interesting chute that went down to the ground floor to get there, and we still have that chute there as we're doing restoration. And the third story, you shutter by modern safety standards, had all the lead acid backup batteries. And I'm talking now like jars of acid with lead coupons in them that provided the backup battery support for the fire alarm telegraph system. So we had racks and racks of sulfuric acid that was over the heads of the guys sleeping during the day or at night. Never kind of figured out that one, but that's how that building was architected. And it's really, it is a really, really neat building. We acquired it in 2019. And so it was not a fire station for 102 years, okay? And during 102 years, people get exceptionally creative by what they do. And that is the curse. The blessing is the bones of the building are solid. The curse is, even as we have architects and engineers working on this, we continue to get gifts and surprises as we work through the building. And this project is a 4-phase project that is approximately $2.5 million in size. We have completed phase 1, which was stabilizing the building and completing the front facade, just to tell the community we're serious about this. Phase 2 is about halfway done. We're in the midst of it right now. But, you know, geez, what was missing out of our fire station? Geez, like a second way and fire escape. Kind of an interesting lesson here. So, you know, obviously we're doing that. And then obviously the modern building and energy codes are requiring us to do significant upgrades appropriately, right? We have to put a sprinkler system in, handicap accessibility, and elevator. And then what I would just say is we're going to open it up to the public where you can see some of the hand-hewn beams, particularly on the 3rd floor, but all of the other exposed woodwork up there, which just basically is open to the atmosphere under the shingles. The energy code, we have to cover a whole bunch of that up. I cry every time I think about this, but we're gonna have certain cutaways so you can kind of see some of the beautiful Bay City wood that was put into that particular station. So what we are doing, our museum today on Patterson Road nominally is open from the first weekend in May through the last weekend in October. And we're just limited because most of the area there, about 16,000 square feet, is unheated. And so you get into the situation where it becomes a little visitor unfriendly as you get there. And we also have to be very careful about what artifacts we're able to store there. We do have a visitor center in the front that is climate controlled, and that's where we do most of our artifact presentation and preservation. We also have some other facilities off-site that have better atmospheric controls. This building will be open year-round. It will be both ventilated and heated, and it will not only, you know, provide education space, but meeting space that'll be made available to the community. And it will be able, then we can take some of our more significant artifacts and make them more available for display. What I will also say is we will maintain the Patterson Road facility, particularly as archival storage and for fire truck maintenance. As I mentioned, we have about 60 trucks, right? Even if you kind of put your mental gymnastics on the ground floor of that station, on a good day, I can probably put 7 or 8 of them. And so we will have a rotating display that will go on, you know, we'll change it out a couple times a year, like many museums do. And then again, we have people who come and want to do history on a specific truck. We just take them down to Patterson Road and we'll work on that particular one. So, but I'll open it up for questions here, but you know, one of the things I always ask people is there are a lot of ways you can help our museum. And so part of that is just like the gift of Box 65, the fire alarm telegraph, or some of the other photos and other things that we have obtained. People all of a sudden find things in their basement, or they're, you know, kind of going, geez, I got a box of old photos from my relatives. And number one, I'm not saying I want your photos, but I'd love to take images of them so that we can put them into kind of our history archives to share with others. As I kind of mentioned, there's lots of interesting things. So like in 1918, there was a book published of the Bay City Fire Department history. It was part of a fundraising activity. And at the time now, the fire chief who took over after Chief Thomas Harding, a guy by the name of Charles Crampton, he led that effort in putting that book together. And this has just some wonderful photos and everything like that. And we have several copies. This one's obviously a little bit more rough around the edges, but we're also digitizing and digitalizing these so that the information in these can be preserved for generations into the future. What I would also just say is it's very interesting. Now, the great-grandson of Chief Crampton and his family, he happens to work for the Smithsonian Institute. It's kind of the historical society down there. He and his family came in and we had a wonderful day, and he brought a lot of images and other things to kind of share about his great-great-grandfather, or great-great-great-grandfather and grandfather. One other little historical part is Chief Crampton Sr. was the fire chief in Bay City up through about 1928, and then his son, Charles Crampton II, was fire chief in the 1960s, 1970s, and early 1980s. What's very interesting, and we had a family give us we got a doorknob, and it's kind of a quick, funny story there. Got a phone call from somebody who said, I have a doorknob from the old Central Fire Station in Bay City. Would you like it? Well, okay, I'll take this. Well, I didn't realize it was kind of it was like a memorialization plaque with the doorknob on it. But what this was is the family lived right next door to the Central Fire Station, and the kids would always spend their time at the firehouse. And so when the firehouse was essentially decommissioned and then demolished, the firefighters thought it would be neat to give to the family a doorknob with kind of a little inscribed plaque, and on the back, it talked about, and I didn't know this until I got the plaque, Chief Crampton, the first, senior, opened Central Fire Station, and his son, Chief Crampton, closed the fire station. And then they went through the history of that. And it was like, and so in our museum, we have that plaque. That's kind of this interesting doorknob story that kind of went through the story of the Crampton family and their affiliation. And like I said, we have dozens, if not hundreds, of these kind of unique stories here. So if you have artifacts, we'd love to at least get the information from those. If you're interested in volunteering, no matter what you do and what your interest is, we have a place for you, okay? From mechanical activities, helping with displays, doing public docent work, or helping with writing letters and social media. And we have a large cadre of people, some of them actually remotely located, like the lady who runs our Facebook page is in Indianapolis. And she just happened to have an affiliation with a couple of our people, and she's doing her part by kind of working remotely. We have a place for you. Lots of things to do there. One other quick funny story. In the midst of COVID, a family member of mine mentioned that in his church down in Frankenmuth, there were two people that he noticed that were older gentlemen who were starting to have some need to, they were getting a little stir crazy, and they wanted to help on doing restoration of motorized apparatus or motorized trucks. And when they first came to us, the rule was we only do Model Ts. We do Model Ts. And what I would just say is we had some Model Ts that needed to be worked on. They hadn't run in 40 years, and these gentlemen did a phenomenal job, and our two Model T chassis vehicles are now running, and one of them runs and pumps, and we made remarkable progress. But as they got affiliated with our museum, we kind of broke their will a little bit, and they've now done a Buick, they've done an REO Speedwagon, and really work on almost any of the combustion engines we have. And it's kind of a funny joke here that they kind of got the firebug in that standpoint, and they really on our gasoline combustion engines have been really, really strong supporters in this area. Someday, and I'd be more than glad to tell you, we are in the midst right now of a restoration project in the 1950s and early 1960s. The Glockstein family on Tuscola Road manufactured fire engines here in Bay City. It was the Valley Fire Engine Manufacturing Company, and they made about 100 trucks. That was kind of their entire run. And I have been working very, 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 very diligently to try to get one so that we could work on it and have it in the collection. You know, obviously we're a museum that we're looking for relevant things. And that came true. I say, unfortunately, there was a gentleman who knew I wanted one. He had one, but he didn't want to give it up until he died. And his promise was, Mike, nobody in my family wants this truck, and when I die, I will will it to the museum. And literally the fall 2 years ago, a lawyer called me and said, I have a fire truck for you. And I knew more about the fire truck than the lawyer did. And so we have done, and the neat part about these is they were all done on Willys Jeep chassis. The Glockstein family was a Willys distributor, and then they also distributed Darley out of Melrose Park, Illinois, fire equipment. And so they made these outdoor trucks generally for the fire service, forest fighting service. And so a lot of them were deployed in the western part of the country. And so this one was in okay condition. It has given us, like all old trucks, a few gifts that we've had to work on, but now we are at the point the engine has been rebuilt, the pump has been rebuilt, and we're actually getting now the cosmetic work. And if I'll show you in just a moment our Facebook page, you can kind of stay up update. We actually got a large amount of red paint, which is very expensive in this area, that was donated, and we're doing the repainting of that. And so during the summertime, in different car shows and parades, we'll be featuring that truck, and it'll be the only Willys fire truck that you'll see in the parade. But it's the Valley fire truck made here on South Tuscola Road. And then obviously, you know, donations or, you know, just follow and share. I guess the last thing I'll say is we are kind of the undiscovered gem of museums. And what I just say is we're not a foo-foo museum, okay? So we have artifacts and we have some things that we protect and we need to make sure we preserve. But with most of our collection, it's okay to touch it. And so as you bring children and you bring family members, you can sit on a seat, you can get a picture. We actually end your visit with a fire truck ride, weather permitting. And most families that come leave with a huge smile on their face. And while we're doing a lot of work on social media, last summer we were featured on Under the Radar by the two crazy guys that kind of look at these things. And we got a huge uptick in visitors from the south part of the state. If you can just tell a couple of neighbors or friends about the museum, share our Facebook piece, you'd do me a huge favor in that, because it's the knowledge of this museum, and again, where we're going at Station 3, that are very, very impactful. And so our contact information, and those of you who are now high-tech, I'm trying to move into the high-tech side, it's a QR code. If you just take a picture of it with your camera on your phone, that'll take you right to our Facebook page and you can follow us. So I've added that there. The upper right-hand side happens to be a pen and ink drawing that was featured in the 1890 edition of Fire and Water magazine. I said, you know, Chief Carding was always good about getting information about Bay City. We have a copy of that. And then we have kind of a number of Bay City historical apparatus. And we also have, I threw one other slide because somebody might ask the question, ask the question. We also now own both parts of the Fire Department of New York super pumper system. Okay, I've violated one rule in the museum part. We have a principled mission, which is the fire service history of the Great Lakes Bay region, okay? And that's, when we make decisions about what we curate, that's what we really use, with one exception. There was this iconic collection from the city of New York of the, at the time and still today, the single largest firefighting pumper that was ever made. And it was put in service in 1965, out of service in 82, and sent to a junkyard in 1989. And Mr. Dobson, Jim Dobson, found out about that and jumped to it and rescued it from that area. At the same time, there was a family in Southern California that rescued its cousin called the Super Tender. And over the years, we've stayed in touch with that family. And unfortunately, the husband who owned that truck passed away. Now, the super pumper was in rougher condition. We preserved it and we're doing selective restoration. Theirs was in better condition. They were actually able to drive it across the country. Lots of colorful stories about driving a large semi-truck sized unit across the country to Southern California. But unfortunately, the husband passed away 2 years ago. And his wife finally decided that she thought in his honor, the trucks should be put together and displayed together. And so this spring, we'll be unveiling. We brought the trucks, if you've kind of looked at any of the media, in December. And I learned a valuable, well, I knew this, but I learned a valuable lesson that you move trucks from California to Michigan like in August, right, where there's no snow and everything there. But we had some logistical issues that occurred, and we ended up having to move it in December, which out of California was kind of cool. But once we kind of got into the more temperate climate, we had some interesting opportunities. Everything made it safely, and now we're working with a couple of diesel mechanics out of the Mack and Volvo distributor network here in the Great Lakes Bay region, and we're going to have both of the cabs up and running, and you'll start to see the Super Tender at select car shows and displays throughout the summer. And so that's just one collection. It is a very, very important piece of firefighting history. There are a lot of people around the globe who are enthralled by this. I would even say a little bit of a cult in this area, and we felt it was really, really important in preserving fire history, even though it's not Bay City fire history. So the biggest thing I can do is, Bay City, right, we had the waterfront and the lumbering area, we had fire boats. Defoe made fire boats. This is kind of like a fireboat on wheels, so I kind of stretched the mission here a little bit to make that work. So those are kind of my prepared comments and remarks, but I'm very open to taking any questions that you might have, or if there's anything more that you want to learn about the museum and its collection. The question in the back.
Marvelous presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I want to know, how safe are we in this building?
So,
There's a door there.
yeah. So a couple of comments here, right? This is an older building, but there are many, many egress points, and you are all on the ground floor, right? So when you start to look at these complicated fires, it normally is limited fire escapes, and also where you have multiple stories. And obviously, the higher you get up, the more complicated it is to work through that. I don't believe there's sprinklers, automatic fire sprinklers anywhere in the building, but obviously buildings today that are built to modern codes, almost all of your assembly and sleeping like hotels have to have automatic fire sprinklers, and those also make a huge, huge difference. Yes, ma'am.
Just to let you know, we have just installed a brand new fire system. So yes, state-of-the-art fire system, brand new, so no worries, you're safe.
Right, so I guess that's another important point, right? And maybe just something to take home from your own perspective. The sooner you know you have a problem, the more time you have to get out of that problem and call for help, right? We go back to the Monroe Hotel fire. They spent 2 hours looking, they knew something was wrong, and rather than call the fire department, they were looking to see what was going on there. They lost valuable time. I would just say in the typical home environment, you have minutes, right, between the difference between living and dying. And so, smoke alarms with batteries that are working, extremely important. And when it goes off, make sure you're up and out of the house. And then you can kind of figure out what do we do from there. But getting out of the house is absolutely critical, and you have no time. And that's why smoke alarms are so very important. My fire service safety message of the day here. But no, thanks for the question. Yes, ma'am.
I get a thing on my phone called Michigan Moments or something, and it's always about, and they, when they talked about Bay City, they talked about a 1912 fire in a Clark hotel, and 3-story, and it was totally destroyed by fire.
So yeah, so we have obviously a number of buildings that have burned. I mean, from the Oppenheim building that was there, the Westover Theater. The issue and the reason I picked these was because of their severe impact and their monumental area. But yeah, like I said, we probably have about 100, the Redondo building, right? Which was another one that had all kinds of combustible structure, but it happened at after hours. And I think there were 2 injuries, there were no fatalities there. So that's kind of where, I picked the fires from here. But yeah, I mean, we can walk through most of those buildings and some of the history there. Right, and unfortunately, a lot of those today remain as parking lots or completely redeveloped areas.
We've got a volunteer orientation coming up in April.
We do. So yeah, Jeff, thanks for doing that. If anybody is interested, well, I'll go back to my paid political one here of the following us on Facebook. We list every week activities that we're doing. And if you're interested in even exploring the opportunities of volunteering, we have a couple of volunteer opening nights that we're doing in April at the museum, where you get a chance to kind of see some of the things and learn about, whether you want to do docent, some of the displays, some of the maintenance activities. If you're interested in helping with fire engines, we have a place for you. So thanks, Jeff. I do that. But if you go to the Facebook link, either the old school or new school, and just follow us there, you'll get all kinds of information about what's going on. And actually, that picture was that's the Valley Fire Engine.
On my
A
calendar.
couple of guys. Good.
Schedule myself.
Yep, 3456 Patterson, right near the intersection of Patterson and Wheeler Roads, just down by the SC Johnson plant off of Wilder. Yes, sir.
Quick story about the Winona Hotel fire. They had a fire sale for a couple of weekends after the fire, and you could go in and buy artifacts. And so went in and bought a couple chandeliers. One is still hanging in my dining room. The other one is here at the museum. Hopefully someday, I donated probably 25 years, but hopefully someday they exhibit it here. The other artifacts I was able to get out of the hotel has a more interesting story. The items for sale were on the main floor in the big dining room area. And 90% of the building, you could go in the basement also, but the rest of the building was off limits. But being a 25-year-old, what's the yellow tape, do not enter sign mean? And so I began to explore the building gradually and got to share this. I could follow who was running the show there, so to speak, and where I could sneak off to. And I explored the entire building. Up on the third floor, it would be the southwest corner was a premier suite in the hotel. And I believe, I'm not a real architect, but I believe the decor was French provincial, where you had doors with door panels with multiple colors and ornamental woodwork and arched doorways. So as I went down that hall and looked at the very end of the hall was a door, and it was a totally arched door. The entire door was arched to enter that room, but that door was gone. I entered the room, the suite, and there was a set of cafe doors between a kitchen and a dining area that were probably each about 1.5 feet wide, with clear leaded pane windows. Those are somewhere here stored. Then in another section between, I'll call it, there again, maybe a parlor in the dining area. Each one of these rooms was kind of divided off. Were two sets of doors, wide openings, like 6-foot openings. There again, arched doorways, but 6 foot wide. So you have 2 3-foot doors that are arched. And there was another set of those doors that had leaded pane windows in the upper halves. And I said, all of this needs to be saved, but I'm only one person, and how do I get them down in an area I'm not supposed to be in? But when this building goes to demo, or somebody else, a construction worker that really doesn't appreciate the history of the building, what happens to these things? So of course, I pondered how to do this, so came back a few times and would say hello to the folks that are running the sale, and I'd go to the basement, but then there were other stairways that I could find to go to the rest of the building, go do my work, get the stuff disassembled. And now these doors are extremely heavy, and they're 6.5 at least tall. Fortunately, I was a young man at the time. And now, where do I take them? Because you're not supposed to be up there. So I said, all right, I know areas of the basement that have no lights. So of course I came prepared. My snowmobile suit was loaded with tools, and because this building was extremely cold, it was a bitter winter. And so one by one, I took those doors to the basement. They were so heavy, the only way I could go was down a back stairway. It was a narrow stairway, so it was almost like a I don't know, I'll call it a servants or a maintenance stairway. But because the roof had totally burnt through in that area, or the firefighters had cut holes, those stairways were like bobsled runs. So I laid the door on the top of my snowmobile suit, hang onto the railing, and skid down from all the way to the basement, with multiple stairways, and then hide all these things in the dark areas of the basement, then come back on and then find some other artifact to buy, and then come back on another day, wave at Susie that runs the till, go to the basement, start bringing doors up. And she says, well, where'd you get those doors? I said, well, out of the basement. Did I tell the truth? You be the judge. Okay, 2 of those doors are on display upstairs. I had them in my garage for probably 30 years. They wouldn't fit my house. And so I kind of looked around for house restoration people that might do the right thing if it didn't happen to. And finally, I donated all the doors here. And 2 of them are on display here on the main floor with some other displays about the Winona Hotel.
And so just as you kind of close here, take advantage to walk through the museum today. As you go in on the left-hand side, there is a nice display on the Bay City Fire Department history, including a nice display on Chief Harding, and a couple of pieces of memorabilia, including some badges, as well as some very interesting competition speaking trumpets, and actually a parade belt that came from here. And in the Winona Hotel display, there's a beautiful piece of ceramic work that came from the kind of the ground floor of that, of kind of an Indian motif in that area because of the Winona and its history. Those are both, I think, just very monumental. And now there's 2 doors I didn't know about the history of, but that would be there. A total of 6 doors. So thank you very much. I will stay around if you have some individual questions there. So thank you very much for your support and for coming today.